Thank you to the whole CAIRIBU team for inviting me to present today and for the wonderful introduction. So just to preface this talk a little bit, the CAIRIBU Corps reached out to me after I won the Chancellor's Award last year, taking note of my grant funding accomplishments as part of the reason for getting that award, and asked if I would give this talk. At the time, I did not have such a talk prepared, so I took several months to kind of put something together that I think would be really beneficial, specifically for early stage investigators, that kind of is descriptive of my experiences. And doing some of the workshopping for this, I watched a lot of YouTubes for, presentations that people give on how to address funding systems. And I found that most of them really just tend to walk you through the documentation that is provided by the funding bodies themselves. I found it to be incredibly dry material. And so I think what I'm aiming to do today is try and make this a little bit more interesting, certainly not walk you through documents that you are more than capable of reading yourself, but I will give you some hints on the things to look out for in some of those documentation. And so really what this talk is a kind of, we're all going to go for a bit of a hike through what I refer to as the funding landscape, and try and figure out ways to make ourselves stand out from the rest of the crowd. So without any further ado, let me check my slides here. The only disclosure I have for this talk is that everything that is expressed here on the slides or verbally are my own opinions. They don't reflect those of the US government or any of the funding agencies that are mentioned herein, and have no financial disclosures. Just to reintroduce myself, I'm Aaron Dingle. I'm a senior scientist and the co-director of the Microsurgery and Regenerative Medicine Lab within the Division of Plastic Surgery at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I moved to the US in September of 2015 as a postdoctoral researcher, and that's when I really got my first experience of grant writing. So since 2015, I have been responsible for over $5 million of funding, primarily as PI and COI, on grants that have predominantly come through various avenues of the Department of Defense, including the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, the Veterans Affairs, and the Defense Advanced Research Program. But rather than focus on me today, I would hope that everyone is capable of channeling their inner academic squirrel, who's going to be the kind of spotlight of this talk. So the academic squirrel is highly productive, energetic, and always available until they're not, right? It's a common misconception that squirrels hibernate during winter, when in actual fact, they're just writing grants. So you may see them running around frantically during that grant period. That is because they've buried an idea somewhere and they're trying to find it as a way of getting this grant to the people that need to review it in order to get it funded, right? So there are lots of squirrels in the forest of ideas. There are a lot of ideas, and in my experience, there is no idea that is truly new. And so when you're looking at starting off in what is already an established forest of ideas, how do you make yourself stand out? And really that's what the majority of this talk is going to cover. The first thing that you really need to consider is the climate. From a funding perspective, this is knowing your funding bodies. In my opinion, there are 4 primary funding bodies in the United States. This does not include society funding or entrepreneurial or philanthropic funding. But government agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, which I'm sure everybody is more than familiar with, but also the Department of Veterans Affairs, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs are substantial funding bodies within the United States that you should be aware of. And so they kind of direct the climate of research in the US, in my opinion. And they all seem to work together pretty well, but to the same extent, they have their own ideas on what's important to them and what they're funding. So as far as assessing the climate, you want to know what these funding bodies stand for, and they make that as digestible as possible. The information is everywhere, and they are as transparent as they can possibly be. So any current funding opportunities will be available directly on their website. I would encourage you to join their mailing lists, where they regularly send you updates on potential funding and current funding. On their website, you'll also find their mission statements, and you can look at their funding histories. So you can look for your specific area of interest and see how well it's fared getting funding over the years, even decades, for some of these institutions. They have a ton of tips for investigators. They regularly hold webinars, often that are directly associated with current funding opportunities. They have contact details readily available, and they encourage you to reach out and ask for help in navigating their website and their funding bodies. And they're active across the spectrum of social media. So if you have a particular social media that you like to use, you will find these funding bodies on there. You will find them promoting their work. You will find them promoting researchers. You will find them promoting problems that they're looking to solve. And then, of course, once you understand the climate, there is the weather, which is what's happening out the window for you currently. For those of you in Wisconsin, we're finally getting some sun, which is nice. This is the forecast for the week here, given that we did have snow as recently as last week. So as far as funding bodies are concerned, the weather is what they're currently funding, right? These often come out in the form of funding opportunity announcements, or FOAs, or sometimes term program announcements. These are readily available on their websites. Excuse me. Just yesterday, I looked up the NIH's NIDDK, as well as the CDMRP website, and you can see that both of those have numerous funding opportunities that are currently either getting ready to make an announcement or are currently announced and active, and you can apply for. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see funding opportunity from the Department of Defense, the CDMRP's peer-reviewed orthopedic research program, the PRORP. This was last year's call, which I applied for, and I am currently in the process of going through the just-in-times for this grant. But they also have this year's funding announcement live and active in anticipation of Congress's bills that will be announced in June. So typically with the congressionally directed medical research programs awards specifically, they are based on how much money Congress allocates in every financial year. So they're never guaranteed money, and that is continually announced in the form of program announcements that I would advise you to keep an eye on. So once you understand the weather and the climate, the next thing that I think is the most important aspect to cover is the life cycle of ideas, right? So you really want to know where your idea fits into the award ecosystem. And I think even as young or new investigators, you might not necessarily have to start at the beginning, okay? It depends on how developed your idea is. It depends on what the scientific consensus is. So I'll go through all of these three areas, from development, basic research, and translational. So development kind of speaks for itself, but for those of you that are not aware of it, there are a ton of early grants that are there specifically to help early career researchers get established. They are also there for both early and established career researchers to push boundaries on the current science consensus. And they're also there to generate preliminary data. So if you're an established researcher, you have a new idea that you think is a bit left field, or you just have an idea that's a new area of research for you and you do not have preliminary data, then you can apply to these developmental grants. If you're an early career researcher and you don't necessarily have the track record that established career researchers do, then I would say that this is your first port of call. Quite often they require no preliminary data whatsoever. And I have indeed applied for grants through this mechanism where they've said preliminary data will exclude you from this funding. Okay. From the DoD and the congressionally directed medical research programs, those tend to come out in the form of idea discovery awards. This is where I got my first independent grant as a PI. They're typically run from 12 to 24 months long, and they range from $200,000 to $750,000 in value. In the NIH, there are pathways to independence, which are your K99 or R00 grants. There are small grants in R03s, and there are exploratory or developmental grants, which are your R21s. The next stage in the life cycle is research. This is where I think the majority of research actually takes place. This is where most people spend the majority of their career. And I think this is predominantly inhabited by career researchers in it for the long haul. So at this point, you do need to be established as a researcher. If you're an early career researcher, this may mean that you have several publications and you're working in a laboratory with a mentor that has substantially established themselves in that field, and therefore with their mentorship and your previous publications, you would be established enough to apply for some of these funding opportunities. But I would stress that you do need a track record for most of these calls. And you want to have some solid preliminary data, right? So if you don't have that, then you are looking at the developmental stage. If you do have that, then you really want to consider going for the hardcore research aspect of this, which tends to mean longer time periods and greater funding ceilings than development awards alone. So in the DoD, these are often termed investigator-initiated research awards or advanced technology development awards. In the NIH, this is the kind of classic R01 that everybody's familiar with, but there are also independent science awards in the KO2. I would say that there is a major point of difference between these two funding bodies here in that because the CDMRP's funding is congressionally mandated, and they don't know where funding is going to be allocated by Congress every year, they don't necessarily have the option to roll over your grant into a subsequent grant renewal style like the NIH does. What makes NIH more accessible for career researchers is the capacity to submit a grant, get it funded, and then resubmit as a continuation of the previous grant for an extended period of time. Anything sent into the DoD is effectively a new grant, whether they've seen it before without any changes, or whether you've applied once, been rejected, and sent it back, made changes or not, it'd be considered a new grant. And then for me, the translational grant aspects are rather important. I think that a lot of people, particularly in the medical field and MDs specifically, get into research because they have tangible problems that they want tangible solutions for, rather than adding to the body of scientific knowledge. So translational grants are really important. In my experience, they're far more common through DoD mechanisms such as the CDMRP, as well as DARPA, or the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and even the VA. But I would stipulate that any applications through the VA are limited by, you need to have a 5/8 appointment at the VA to be eligible for VA funding. So that is one limitation to the VA. That's not a limitation to any of the other funding bodies. So for clinical translational grants, you really need solid mechanisms here. You need to have had more than a development grant. You need to have several research grants prior to that. If you haven't already done so, this is your opportunity to move into large animal preclinical models or potentially clinical trials and get access to patient populations. So the mechanisms need to be solid. From the DoD, this is typically a technology or therapeutic development award, and they do quite frequently offer clinical trial awards. The NIH tends to have less translationally based grants in my experience. But some programs do have them from time to time, so it's always worth keeping an eye out. Otherwise, you may be able to fund translational style research through an R01, and then otherwise you will have to check for institute-specific calls from the NIH. And now I think undoubtedly everybody's favorite topic is the politics of grantsmanship. What this slide is really about is just how important relationships are in funding opportunities. Okay, so for each of the grant calls or that come out, they're going to have a program manager, a program leader that is going to be the point of contact for that specific application. I would highly recommend that you reach out to the programmatic staff as early as possible, generally with a sufficiently prepared aims page that has a hypothesis and your aims in a single page, if nothing else, that they can review and open dialogues onto whether or not that's the right fit for the current call that they have. Programmatic staff are exceptionally helpful, and in fact, it is their job to make sure that the funding available is allocated appropriately. But I do need to preface that and say that they are restricted in the amount of information and help they can give you. They cannot tell you how to modify your grant. They cannot tell you whether they think you will be successful. They can tell you if they think you will be unsuccessful. So they might tell you, well, what you have in your aims does not really fit with the vision of this call. But they're also highly likely to then put you on to somebody that has an appropriate call that would be suited to you. So everybody across the NIH, all the program directors know each other, same for the DoD and the VA, and they know who's funding what. And so they will give you the opportunity to send your aims page to a different program manager that may be better suited to the kind of research that you're trying to do. As I mentioned in one of the early slides, the information for programmatic staff is often available on the website, is usually also often available in the grant call. But another thing to do is attend webinars and conferences held by these agencies. They quite frequently have webinars related to specific announcements where they will tell you what they're looking for and provide a question and answer section for you to ask questions about whether your research might fit into what they're looking for. And you really just want to form relationships with your program director. Okay. The other thing to do is to attend conferences. For me, the Military Health Symposium is a central place to try and meet program directors from the various Department of Defense research funding agencies. They quite often have booths there that tell you the kind of research they're funding, give you hints and tips on how to apply for them, when to look out for things, what websites are being the most helpful as far as getting information for writing grants. If you go to a conference and there are program directors there, the easiest way to spot them is that they will generally have an enormous line of people queuing up waiting for 5 minutes of their time. So don't go there expecting to just kind of catch them and have a chat. Be prepared, have your aims page memorized for that elevator pitch, or have it ready to send to them, and just introduce yourself, get their email, and continue that conversation beyond the conference. The next most important relationship is the mentor-mentee relationship. This is really important, especially for early career researchers, where mentorship is really just the strongest form of collaboration that you're going to have throughout your research career, right? This is an investment in each other. Essentially, you have common goals, and it involves a lot of mutual trust. As the mentor, it's your job to really provide the wisdom of your experience, including what's worked for you and what hasn't, to help that mentee establish themselves. And then as the mentee, it's really your job to take that wisdom on board and then use your enthusiasm, passion, and energy to really get that research into a functional grant and get that grant funded. for me, I would not have had any of the success I think that I've had in grants over the years if it wasn't for a really strong mentorship from my supervisors and collaborators throughout this whole experience. So I think that is really the key to the success of most early career researchers, is how much wisdom you can gain from your mentors. Another topic that I'm sure everybody is just really thrilled about, how to deal with rejection. So on the left-hand side there, I've pretty much written out my process for you. I probably spend a lot more time than I care to divulge on that second bullet point there. But again, this is where your relationships with mentors and program directors really comes in handy, okay? So once a decision on a grant has been made, let's just say that it's been rejected, you know, one thing that I often do, especially if I've had points of contention, is we'll reach out to the program director and ask them what happened in the room. I can't change the decision. The decision is final, right? So I go in there knowing that I can't change the way mustard tastes. But what you can do is understand where you went wrong as the author of that grant and the PI of that grant. You know, what was not clear? What did the programmatic panel have a discussion about or a disagreement over, right? And to be completely honest here, in some instances, the program gets it wrong, right? They're individuals, they're people, they're scientists, they're doctors, they're passionate about this work. It is not really a personal attack on you. It is not a personal attack on your research. Sometimes they just fail to reach an agreement. Or it might just be the fact that, you know, somebody else came along that was better established or had a more concise set of aims. And that's the only reason you missed out, right? And you can't get that information necessarily from just reading the comments, particularly if it's an NIH submission that did not get discussed, right? Then you don't get any kind of feedback whatsoever. And so that's why it's really important to reach out to the program directors at that point, as well as your mentors, and find out where they think you could have improved. And that's when you make the decision to resubmit or to not resubmit, right? And so for those of you that choose to not resubmit a grant for whatever reason, that's why I put this picture of a dead log here, okay? So this tree might have passed its expiration date, as you may feel that your grant has done, but that does not mean that it is simply just dead wood, right? You know, dead trees in forests provide shelter for woodland creatures. They provide nutrients for the next stage of growth in the forest. And they're an important part of the ecosystem. So a grant that you have shelved and decided to never resubmit and never see the light of day doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't parts of that that are valuable. First of all, the experience was valuable, but second of all, what can you take from it, right? Does it give you new questions or a new way of looking at the same problem? Does it introduce new problems you weren't aware of? Are there things in there like specific aim number 3 that was just perfect and you can use in your next grant and disregard the rest of it, right? You spent time on it, you nurtured it, you grew it, but just because it didn't take hold doesn't mean that it doesn't hold any value in the rest of your career. Another really important aspect for me is diversification. And I mean that in every sense, right? There is more than one type of squirrel, and inevitably you have to convince all of the squirrels that your idea is a fantastic idea. So one thing you can do is submit to multiple funding bodies. All of the funding bodies, as far as I'm aware, actively encourage that you submit to more than one. It is highly unlikely that you will get both, but if you do, then you probably don't need to be watching this webinar right now. And maybe I should sit in some webinars from you. But actively submitting to multiple fronts means that you're going to get a different audience both times, right? No two calls for funding are the same. They will be looking at different aspects, and maybe you appeal to one of those more than the other, but you will never know unless you submit it, right? It's also really important to attend different meetings outside of what you would regularly go to for your particular areas of interest. For me, a real eye-opener was attending the Department of Defense annual meeting, which is the Military Health Symposium, every year, because you see this wide range of research that I would never have even known existed. It's a great opportunity to talk with the researchers alike. They also have a really good, solid patient population for people that are there kind of looking for answers that create their own questions that you might be able to assist in, right? But it also gives you a great overview of the enormity of some of these research areas that you may not have known existed, and you might find new collaborations and new avenues that you never had thought of before, right? Just because something is standard practice in one aspect of medicine doesn't mean that it's utilized by other aspects of medicine. So maybe you can take something that's pre-existing and reapply it or apply it for the first time to your specific field for benefit to your patients. And the other one is collaborate. So if you go to these meetings and meet new people, you will inevitably find new people to collaborate with, new people to discuss ideas with. The other thing to consider that's really important for early career researchers is not to necessarily think that you're just going to submit a grant as PI and get it, right? So it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to put those grants together. And sometimes you might be better to use your time to serve as a co-I and write a small portion of a larger grant, right? So earlier in the talk, when I talked about applying for those R01s or anything in the research capacity, if you have a mentor that is writing an R01, can you apply your specific knowledge and interests to a single aim of that grant? Can you serve as a co-I on that grant that will help build your reputation with that funding body, that will give you publications, that will give you experience in writing grants that is recognized by all the funding bodies? Because of course you will always submit your current and pending support documents with any grant application, right? And you also get the experience of writing a grant without having to write the whole grant. And as a part of that experience, it's not really just you writing this whole thing from your own vision. It's you taking someone else's vision and then having to adapt your own style to fit the larger narrative of that grant, and be complementary to it, rather than just write the whole thing in a single form. Another aspect I found really beneficial in my capacity to write grants is to serve as a reviewer on grant panels. I do not do this nationally, but I do it within the department. We have an internal review process where you can have your grant reviewed before it would go out. We use the NIH platform, and several members of the committee have sat on the NIH boards. And so they run them just as if it was an NIH review panel. Because of course you're always biased to your own material. If you spent months putting a grant together, you're always going to be convinced it's really, really good, and you might have your blinkers on sometimes, and it may not be as good as you think. The first step there is to have your mentors go over that and have them spend considerable time going over it and really play devil's advocate to make sure that everything you need is in there. But the other one is to serve as a reviewer and really understand what it's like on the other side of the fence, right? So if you review for journals, then you already know the peer review process. But again, it's slightly different when you're reviewing grants. It's also really important to hear other reviewers' perspectives on grants that may not be aligned with your own thinking, may not be aligned with your own thought processes or your own logic. And these are often the kinds of conversations and maybe even disputes that happen that as a submitter of a grant, you don't really hear and you don't really see. All you get maybe is a line or two in an email that says this was inappropriate, but you don't really understand the thinking behind that. And so when you're actively participating in this kind of thinking and discussions, it improves the way that you communicate in your grants. So I would highly encourage you to actively participate in panel discussions if you can. If you can't do it for grants, then you might be able to seek out opportunities to review for papers, because I think as a reviewer of papers, you still read them differently as to if you're a consumer of those papers for the purposes of your own research. So a major blanket message of this talk is that funding bodies want to fund you, okay? Effectively, that's their job, that's their role. They have large pots of money that they are dedicating to try and find new solutions to improve the state of healthcare, to improve quality of life for individuals and for groups of people at large. So they would be remiss if they didn't do everything in their power to try and fund you. That does not mean that they can give you advice that gives you an edge. That certainly means that there are questions that they will be unable to answer according to their code of conduct, but they do have very strict rules in their code of conduct for what they can and can't answer. They're not afraid to tell you if they can't answer it, but if they can, then they will do so. And so really what that comes down to is you having the capacity to ask them those questions, right? And as a kind of cherry on top to understand how much they really do want to fund you, last year, the NIH put out a loan repayment scheme. This is particularly relevant to the early career researchers that are MDs and going to be practicing physicians and clinicians, because effectively you can look at, $50,000 loan repayments per year if you're working on relevant grants from NIH funding bodies, okay? So, when you're trying to decide whether or not you have time for research, whether or not you have the passion for research, but ultimately what is the value of you doing research while you're in medical school or while you're an early career physician, I would argue that this is it. This would be the primary value to you as an individual. And it should be an encouragement because ultimately all of the funding bodies, including the NIH, realize that tomorrow's doctors are also going to be the people that come up with solutions of the future. Okay, so this is a way to make sure that MDs remain involved in the research process because ultimately you're the front line of patient care. And so it's integral that you maintain that visibility and that connectivity with the research world, as well as providing top care to your patients. So a few take-home points here. Climate and weather. Know the funding bodies, know the mechanisms, know what they've funded in the past, know what they're funding now. Think about where what they're funding and what you're interested in fits into the life cycle of ideas. So what stage is your idea at? Are you ready to jump right into mainstream research? Do you need to develop that idea? Are you looking at something with clinical applicability? What are your short-term goals of your current research, but also where do you want to go with your career, right? Do you want to stay in the research realm? Are you looking specifically to come up with clinical deliverables that will change the state of healthcare? Those are important questions to think short-term and long-term. Have as many discussions as frequently as you can with collaborators, colleagues, program managers, mentors, peers. Always test your ideas, and if you can find someone that's willing to read what you've written, make sure that you get it to them in a as quick a manner as possible. Diversify. Think about how you can contribute without having to take the primary responsibility as part of your early career research, if that's the case. So can you be a co-I? Can you be a participant on a grant? Can you do the research yourself on behalf of a PI? There are no real set paths to success here. And so to some degree, you kind of have to pull yourself up by your own bootstrap. But I would argue that there is an enormous community of people who are willing to help you, who are actually looking to help you. And so the more people you speak to in your area of interest as well as outside of that, the more likely you are to succeed. And then review. If you have the capacity to participate in the review process, do it, whether that's as a journal reviewer or more specifically as a reviewer of grants. When I come back to discussing frequently with mentors and the importance of the mentor-mentee relationship, every now and then you get a grant that the mentor hasn't seen, right? It's just not ready. And if it were to go to the NIH, it would go straight in the not discussed basket. And so by sending it internally to our group, they get the opportunity to revise those grants, to get the opportunity to at least discuss it with us, if not encourage them to discuss it with their mentor, and really get that feedback ahead of time, so that when it does come time to submit to the funding body, that grant is as ready as it can be. And with that, I will thank you for your time and open it up to any questions.